Darkly Splendid Abodes, the official podcast of Toronto Thelema. Exploring, if you will, practical philosophy, from science and the workings of the mind to spirituality, esotericism, and magic. Stooping down, dipping my wings, I came into the darkly splendid abodes. In 1904 of the Vulgar Era, the world was destroyed by fire and a discarnate entity dictated a book in 3 chapters to Aleister Crowley, who himself only begrudgingly, and after several years, came to accept what the book had to say. We'll dig into Crowley's account of the circumstances surrounding the reception of the Book of the Law, including the staggering synchronicities and potential proofs he recorded, as we look at Chapter 7 of the Equinox of the Gods. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law.
Love is the law, love under will.
Today we are back to talk about the Equinox of the Gods. This is the Book 4, well, I should say Volume 4 of Book 4. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. So this is, we're going to specifically be looking at Chapter 7, and it's essentially detailing the circumstances surrounding the reception of the Book of the Law and anything basically Crowley can throw at us regarding that.
The reason I wanted to look at this is that we had done the introduction to the Book of the Law last time, and that promised that forthcoming would be a volume that talked in more detail about some of the proofs for the spiritual provenance of the text, that this was not actually written by Aleister Crowley, but by a non-embodied entity. Well, that's perhaps pushing it, but a discarnate entity called Aiwaz,
which is Latin for defleshed.
Really? Because well, that's cool.
Or unfleshed, maybe.
Unfleshed.
Is more appropriate. I don't know when unfleshed is technically appropriate, but...
Gross. And so that promised this, and so we went through some of this to see what would be the most interesting reading, and it's not what I thought it was going to be. I mean, there's a little bit of... there is some gematria stuff in here, but it doesn't actually deal with what I would consider to be like the ciphers in the book, or and it does talk a little bit about how there's predictive material, but it doesn't say what is predicted exactly, except
he takes a couple of pot shots, but
it predicts war, and so then we see war. It doesn't do that thing where it says like every publication of the book has been 9 months ahead of a major international conflict.
Yeah, that was a prediction to come later.
That's one of the things that is talked about. It's not explicit in here. This is more like there's some stuff in here about how Crowley, not in this chapter, but about how Crowley tested Rose, proving that she was spiritually inspired before he took her advice about how to receive the book. And then there's other things in here about how one of the major proofs is that it predicts a son to come who will have more insights. And then by 1920, when this is when sections of this were completed, Crowley had already met Akkad, and Akkad had already fulfilled this promise. So even though we're not going to get a stab at those long, alphanumeric codes or various other things, there are some useful proofs in here, evidences that Crowley's using to say that this is not a forgery. This is in fact something I've received. But it's mostly the story of how the reception was undertaken. How did you enjoy reading this
Oh, good
this
question.
time?
This is one of those portions that I guess portions isn't the word, but this kind of material you find if you read a lot of Thelemic stuff, you find yourself reading this territory over and over again. So it can become a slog very easily. Because it's like reading about Crowley's mountain climbing adventures. It's like, okay, I've been there. I know what this is about. So it's easy to become a little bit blasé about it. But as usual, doing it for one of these deep dips is really fun because it gives some kind of purpose behind going back into it. Besides, I guess I should say, I noticed how commonly I'll read through the text and not really completely grasp everything, or not really completely, I'll read a paragraph and be like, okay, fine, and just keep moving on, but not really put it into context.
Right.
So this is really nice for that.
I found, of course, I know the story, right? The story of the reception. You pick up any biography and it's in there. You read through some of the confessions. You read through some of the Equinox material. There are so many places where the story of the reception is sort of told and retold. And I found this to be unfamiliar to me somehow. And I know I've read it before because some things that I've been looking for turn out to be in here. Like this cute thing where one of his proofs for the spiritual authorship of the Book of the Law is that I promise the spelling mistakes are not my own. And I just think that's cute. So I wanted to remember what the reference is. And it's in here, so I know I've read it before. But yeah, it felt like a first read to me, and
all this time I thought Rose Kelly had been the one dictating the Book of the Law to him, and it turns out it wasn't, because I just had to read the text. And
Darren is trying to make me angry. It's which is fine. I'm allowed to be angry. It's explicit in here.
It's couldn't be more explicit throughout, really.
Yeah, that he's alone. There's one specific quotation where one of the things that people who believe Rose Kelly dictated the Book of the Law will point at is this passage where if you look at the manuscript, there's a place where the penmanship changes. Some things are struck out and edited, even though one should not change so much as the style of a letter. There are places where the text is struck out and someone else's handwriting, spooky, has made corrections. And he just explains it. He just says that he failed to hear the Spirit appropriately in a couple of places, and later on, him and Rose do more spirit work together. She invokes Horus and then he invokes Horus for her, and then she uses her spirit contact to make the corrections. And this is supposed to be evidence, more evidence of the fact that the reception was made through a genuine spirit contact,
a discarnate entity,
because he speaks, he receives the text from Iowaz when he's alone,
and he's hearing a voice in the corner of the room, which is a man's voice but without accent. So if she was able to affect that, fine. But
and then later Rose makes some corrections, invoking the same spirit, and Crowley says, "How? She was not in the room."
Yeah.
But he's not genuinely asking. It's a rhetorical question. He's trying to impress upon you that the spirit interceded and helped her to make those corrections. And even if you disbelieve him in this, right? Even if you think that that the idea of spirit contact is too woo, and that the book was written through Crowley's contact with his own subconscious or something like that, it still doesn't mean Rose has to be in the room. It just means she has to write down anything, and he likes it. So it's no evidence that she was there. especially when he says explicitly she wasn't there. and whose handwriting is it? Well, Crowley says it was Rose's. So there's no mystery. There's
the
absolutely
two
no
passages where this happens. The first one is in chapter 1, and it's the 5-pointed star with the circle in the middle, and the circle is red. The second instance is in chapter 3, and she adds in the words "Kof-Nia," where he didn't quite make it out. That's it.
Yeah, and there's another place where there's a correction made in Crowley's hand, and that's supposed to be verboten. Change not even the style of the letter, but the Spirit specifically says, write this in whiter words, but move on. He's written something down. He doesn't understand it. The Spirit says it doesn't matter. You try to understand it, clean it up. But so that there's one place in the text where he has specific dispensation to correct it, and he corrects it. And
then there's also the two passages from the Stele of Revealing, or his paraphrase of it, that he inserts later on.
But he's told to insert them explicitly.
And it has portions of it as for reference purposes in the manuscript.
Yeah, and the other thing I thought was cute, the thing I found most convincing actually is when Crowley's trying to say this is a received teaching. It's not a forgery. I've done forgeries before, so you know what they look like. I thought, that's actually quite compelling. There's a list of his previous forgeries, and he's right. They're nothing like this. So, should we kind of try to just quickly tell the story of the reception before we go through this, assuming that people haven't heard it? Or should we just start going through the text?
It's I guess we can give a quick rundown, but I don't want to belabor it too much because, like I say, this is all over the place. We had a little bit of it hinted at in the introduction to the Book of the Law, but essentially he's in Cairo with his wife. They're on their honeymoon that's been lasting for months and months. I think they went to Cairo on the way by, then they came back to Cairo on the way back. And so when they returned, he evoked the fairies? Sylphs.
So he's trying to... So Crowley's given up magic work almost entirely by his own suggestion here, because he's frustrated with the Golden Dawn and starts to feel like it's all nonsense. He's operating with a kind of Buddhist mindset where not only doesn't he believe in spirits, but he sort of doesn't believe in anything. All things are projections of his mind, and he's trying to understand a more correct relationship with a world that doesn't exist. He's living in a world of illusion. But sort of because, when you're in a new relationship, you want to show off. At some point he uses Liber Samach, just the airy paragraphs of Liber Samach, the Bornless ritual, in the chamber of the Great Pyramid, apparently, to show Rose the sylphs, and sort of nothing happens. And then later on, a couple of months later, he tries it again, and this time, again, it sort of squibs out. But she, rather than being impressed by the sylphs, just starts talking and won't shut up with this kind of schizophrenic insistence that they want your attention. They are calling you. They are calling you.
It's all about the child.
And he finds this quite annoying. But after several days, she doesn't kind of calm down. So he will interrogate her as if she's a spirit, get lots of correct answers, and begrudgingly admit that that's spooky enough to pay attention to. She will then suggest a ritual structure for him. On the spring equinox, he does the supreme invocation, and then 22 days later he begins receiving the text of the book of the law. 1 hour from noon to 1 on 3 successive days. He goes into a room alone, hears a disembodied voice, and writes. And even though he will at other times in his career have profoundly inspired writing, he never again has this sense of a voice speaking to him when he's alone. He does lots and lots of, as we're saying, magic work through mediums, and he also does magic work. Well, he'll try to connect to a spirit and channel himself, but never again in his whole career, before or since, will he hear a voice and take dictation. And so the material that we've chosen to look at today talks about what the experience of taking dictation was like, and how, from looking at the text, you know that this story of the reception has, you can see that this story of the reception has a profound truthiness, because just from reading the text you see things that would be weird if he had written it himself. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it is pretty remarkable when you put yourself in his shoes. It's easy to be cynical. It's easy to look at this and say, okay, well, he's clearly making shit up, or whatever the case may be. But if we suspend disbelief, if we go along for the ride, we can see that he is very intelligent and self-aware. And the way he's describing the circumstances and his own experience of it, he's doing his best, it seems, to be very frank and self-conscious about what the actual circumstances were. And he's right in the sense that if this is what he believed it to be, which is communication with a discarnate being that had knowledge that's beyond anything we can comprehend and wrap our minds around, in terms of just how, some of this stuff is possible, how it could work by basic cause and effect, by the rules of cause and effect. And yeah, just the fact that this is verification, as he says, until now, man's soul was a guess. It's like, this is important stuff. This is the kind of thing that, okay, if we want to play with this for a bit, this is pretty serious. This is like, not just the ravings of a madman, if there's some of these proofs going on here.
Here's what he says in the sort of first section of chapter 7. He says, "No forger could have prepared so complex a set of numerical and literal puzzles as to leave himself A, devoted to the solution for years after, B, baffled by a simplicity which, when disclosed, leaves one gasping at its profundity, C, enlightened only by progressive initiation or by accidental events apparently disconnected with the book, which occurred long after its publication, D, hostile, bewildered, and careless even in the face of independent testimony as to the power and clarity of the book, and of the fact that by its light other men have attained the loftiest summits of initiation in the tithe of the time which history and experience would lead one to expect, and E, angrily unwilling to proceed with that part of the work appointed for him which is detailed in chapter 3, even when the course of events on the planet, war, revolution, and the collapse of the social and religious system of civilization proved plainly to him the veracity of the text." That's my own parenthetical, the veracity of the text, because he goes on. But so the proofs here, he says, there's a set of numerical puzzles which he had to study for years in order to solve them. When he did solve them, he was baffled by the simplicity of the solution. Mm-hmm. And then a couple of points about spiritual progress, that people reading the book have been able to use it as a springboard to very, very profound states of realization, so that in a way, the providence of the book sort of doesn't matter. It has the power to do the things that it purports to do. So, and then yes, he says if it were a forgery, he would not be so mad at it. He's angrily unwilling to do the things that it tells him to do, even when, you know, there's work detailed in chapter 3, which you know, he looks around and he sees that, of course, the god of war is the king of the earth in the, you know, at least in the early part of the 20th century, and he still won't take up the banner that's been put upon him. And you know, if you want to be a spiritual leader and you forge a text that makes you look like a spiritual leader, you don't then refuse for the next 12 years to become the thing that you're supposedly pretending to be.
Yeah, I mean, looking at it from the context of Crowley's actual life unfolding is a bit of a different standpoint as well, because it's easy from our standpoint now, him being long dead and his entire life having been completed and closed book. Thinking of it in terms of, okay, he received this Book of the Law when he was 28 and a half years old, as he says. And yeah, so you can just imagine that's your Saturn return coming on. But he would go on to live until the ripe old age of 72. And so he was watching the events of the world unfold throughout that time, and just increasingly buying into the Book of the Law because of that, watching that unfolding. Here's
something I like that I think is insightful. We're trying to dust over the surface of this idea of the aeonic cycles in Thelema, and here's another interesting way to parse it. It continues on from what I quoted before. Proved plainly to him that whether he liked it or no, Rahor Queet was indeed the Lord of the Aeon, the crowned and conquering child whose innocence meant no more than the inhuman cruelty and wantonly senseless destructiveness as he avenged Isis, our mother, the earth, and the heaven for the murder and mutilation of Osiris the man, her son. So two things I like about that. The innocence of the crowned and conquering child mean no more than cruelty and wantonly senseless destructiveness. So an innocence that means a lack of self-awareness about, not a lack of self-awareness, a lack of moral sense that this child is able to just rave destructively through the world, conquering in the way that it says he conquers in the Book of the Law, and that the reason for his violence is that he's trying to enact the revenge of his mother on the earth, because the earth destroyed and mutilated her son, Osiris, which is not the way the myth goes. Isis and Osiris are maybe brother and sister, maybe spouses, and then Horus is the son. But in this, because of the precession of the equinoxes, Isis being first and Osiris being second, and now currently we're in the Horus period, Crowley's imagining that Osiris is the son who for the last 2,000 years has been mutilated by the earth, and now the crown and conquering child has to avenge that 2,000 years of mutilation.
Yeah, in a sense, you could think of it as the previous aeon is kind of like a death obsession, in the sense that it's like negating life with every breath drawn in order to attempt to replace it with something beyond that's supposedly supposed to be granted in return. And so this is responding to that as a saying yes to life.
Yeah, saying yes to life in all of its aspects, though, because the destructiveness of the force is emphasized here. Again, Crowley goes on, and I promise I have not marked out every single paragraph in here as something to read. I've been more selective than I was with the introduction. But this carries on. The War of 1914 and its sequels have proved even to the dullest statesman, beyond the wit of even the most subtly sophistical theologians to gloss, that death is not an unmixed benefit either to the individual or to the community, that force and fire of leaping manhood are more useful to a nation than cringing respectability and emasculate servility, that genius goes with courage and the sense of shame and guilt with defeatism. People are intimidated by the violence of the Book of the Law, and somewhere, I think in Magick Without Tears say, so you disagree with Iowa's, so do we all, right? Of course, it's awful. But the problem is he's not arguing, he's telling you. And Crowley has the immediate evidence, within 5 years, the First World War breaks out. And earlier than that, after the first publication of Liber Al in 1909, I think, in the Equinox, there's some other war, which I forget now because of the profundity of World War I, but some other war which seems quite big.
Yeah, I think it was like a Spanish Civil War, because he mentions that at one point in one of the commentaries.
But there's the brutalness of the conflict evidences the violence of Liber Al really is violence, and it's not nice, but it has predictive value, and it's for people looking optimistically at the turn of the new century, all the sort of prosperity ahead of them in 1900 with technological development and the expanding world and motor cars and airplanes and things that seem like they'll be very nice. I
think Einstein's special theory of relativity was published in 1904. So this is like a good
immediately
indicator.
an anticipator of the atomic bomb
and of relativity as a literal physical fact.
So anyway, you can't ignore the horrible stuff because it's an intrinsic part not only of Thelema, but of Thelema because of the world we're living in under the sovereignty
intrinsic part of the world
of the god of war. I wrote it hating it, he says, also in this chapter.
And there's this passage that he goes into following that, which is like really kind of, it seems a bit like bigging himself up because it's really glorifying himself, but his point is kind of distilled out of that in the end of it, because he says, this long digression is but to explain that I myself, who issue Liber Legis, am no fanatic partisan. There is a little passage in there, though, that I really like, which is, if I can find the right place to start it, he's talking about when the law of Thelema really takes hold, when love designs and will executes the right whereby their God in man is offered to me, the beast, their God. The right whose virtue, making their God of their enthroned beast, leaves nothing, how so bestial, undivine. And of course, this is like, the first thing that comes to mind is ego inflation, but that leaves nothing, how so bestial, undivine. I love that.
Mm-hmm.
It's really pointing out the crux of this thing, It's pantheism in the sense of finding that divinity is in all things.
We see how Nietzsche ends up being later named as one of the prophets of Thelema, not just canonized as a Gnostic saint, but an anticipatory prophet of Thelema, because the Book of the Law really does sort of spiritualize. Even though Nietzsche was sort of atheistic and anti-religious, I guess saying God is dead is not really atheistic. It's a position statement.
Well, I think when it comes to that, I do need to say that with the God is dead statement, it tends to be used out of context a lot, because people just say, Nietzsche said God is dead. And no, Nietzsche cried out, "You have killed God."
Yeah.
And this is what we've done.
God
with
is dead and
rationalism.
we have killed him.
Yes. And this is like a very important point, because Nietzsche saw himself as transitional. He saw himself as a prophet, essentially, of the philosophy of the future.
But also this idea of reintegrating the instincts, right?
Mm-hmm.
We've been talking a lot about Kabbalah today, so let's use the Kabbalistic model. The Nefesh being the animal soul, and the Ruach being the human soul, and other levels of successively more and more spiritual souls that enable us to have a relationship with God. But even the Nefesh, however so bestial, still has the spark of divinity, is still part of the picture. Man is the microcosm of the divine instrument. So people who I'm listening to a podcast right now where they keep saying Malkuth is the dingleberry at the bottom of the tree of life, and if you don't know what dingleberry is, they mean like a hanging ball of shit, and it's really not fair. And the doctrine of the fall of man, notwithstanding, even in traditional Kabbalah, there's the microcosm and the macrocosm, and man is made in the image of God, and this attempt to reintegrate and resorb our instinctual selves that is a vital part of Thelema, and something that Nietzsche also thought was important, and in a way following Nietzsche, Freud and the history of the invention of psychology become sort of a part of that as well. Although I think Crowley does a better job of honoring the intent of honoring Nietzsche's intent than the psychologists do. I think all of the whole of the 20th century is just one meandering apology for Nietzsche, except for Thelema.
Yeah, I mean, Crowley describes himself as a great psychologist, and
Nietzsche says that about himself too.
Yeah, but and I mean, like, anytime somebody bigs themselves up, like most people are gonna kind of have a bad taste in their mouth about it. Makes me think of like something like Jerry Seinfeld. Completely off topic, but this is a comic where he comes off as being very kind of, nose in the air, kind of like too good for other people in some way. And I kind of realized at some point, oh no, you know what? The reason people get that is because so many comics are playing the underdog. And Jerry just doesn't do that. He just owns who he is.
Jerry Seinfeld, I did not realize, is really, really into transcendentalism.
Oh, is that right?
The only way, he says, that he was able to survive 8 years of making a situation comedy was that every day at lunch he would go off and do his 20 minutes of mantra work.
Wow.
And then they'd come back and he'd eat lunch on his feet between takes, because he had been, and the transcendentalists are supposed to meditate twice a day. And he says it wasn't until after he retired from doing the sitcom that somebody finally talked him into doing the morning meditation, as well as the daytime one. But anyway, that's neither here nor there, because those people are that's a dangerous cult, that, unlike what we're doing. But
let's get back to our dangerous third chapter of the Book of the Law.
But Seinfeld strikes me as, in his brashness and self-confidence and his belief that stand-up comedy is the absolute best thing anyone can do for anything, anyone can do, as being a sort of having a uniquely Thelemic position. He's found, not only has he found his own true will, and he's doing that and doing nothing else in this embrace of like stand-up comedy being the coolest possible thing, and it's the thing that I've devoted my life to. Also, he was being interviewed by David Letterman, and David Letterman was whining, I wish I'd done something good for society. And Seinfeld says something like, why? like you'd rather be a mediocre immigration lawyer than the greatest late night host in the history of the form. What you've actually done is achieve greatness, and if you'd done anything else, whether it was inherently more helpful, like let's admit that immigration lawyers are more helpful than late night hosts. David Letterman achieved perfection as a late night host, and the mighty guru Jerry Seinfeld tells his Chila not to despair, because even though he may not believe that he helped people in achieving his own greatness, he's disseminated more greatness throughout the world than if he'd only achieved mediocrity in some other field. So anyway, this is it's important for
it's relevant.
Thelemites not to get hung up on cockiness versus disparagement, because the Scarlet Woman is told to raise herself in pride, and I think all people can take that advice.
Absolutely, yeah, and make yourself shameless before all people.
Shameless before loud and adulterous and shameless before all men.
Yes, and that's a very good perspective to have, and it does say something. Like, I'm talking about, I used to dislike Jerry Seinfeld and thought he was arrogant and this sort of thing, and had that turnaround. So I'm not talking about other people thinking that. I'm talking about me having that moment of clarity when I suddenly realized, okay, wait a second. And that's relevant, because that kind of underdog thing is one of those cultural things that have seeped into our brains and that we were raised on.
When you become a hammer, you sort of see nails everywhere. So the idea that, I thought I was being a little bit stupid in seeing Jerry Seinfeld as like Thelemite par excellence. It's just the dumbest thing. But I just thought I was allowed to go on that tirade because you coincidentally brought up exactly the same figure.
You know what? It's relevant as far as I'm concerned, because it's like we should be looking at things outside of this little closet wizard thing. If we want to think of this as something real that actually takes place in the real world, it ought to be taking place in the real world, and we ought to be able to look at real case studies of it that are outside of magic and outside of technical language, But back to the book.
Who wrote these words? Of course I wrote them. Ink on paper in the material sense, but they are not my words, unless I was be taken to be no more than my subconscious self or some part of it. In that case, my conscious self, being ignorant of the truth of the book and hostile to most of the ethics and philosophy of the book, I was as a severely suppressed part of me. If so, the theorist must suggest a reason for this explosive yet ceremonially controlled manifestation, and furnish and explain the dovetailing of events in subsequent years with his words written and published. He means the world wars and so forth, and also probably Frater Achad and things like this. In any case, whatever I was is an intelligence possessed of power and knowledge absolutely beyond human experience, and therefore I was is a being worthy, as the current use of the word allows, of the title of a god. Yea, verily and amen, of a god. What do you think of that?
Well, this is very much the point. He'll get into the advent of the magical child and all the circumstances surrounding that, and it's pretty wild, like how on the nose everything is. And so this is if we try to bring this into our own experience, I don't know if you've ever had experiences regarding feeling like you're communicating with spiritual entities, and maybe synchronicities being a part of that, for instance. This is a difficult territory because you can so easily be completely off the rails with it. But when it's really hitting, it's like very clear. It's just the problem is when you start making that kind of those synchronicities and things pop up because you're noticing, out of force of habit or whatever. But in this case, this is like, this is overboard. Like, this is very on the nose, and there's no denying it, because there's, it's only in hindsight that you can connect all the dots and say, well, of course. But while, again, thinking of it from Crowley's perspective, as things are unfolding, it shall be his child, and that strangely. And so the way that the magical child came about was a very strange kind of story. And he produced the key that unlocked the Book of the Law in so many ways. So this speaks really strongly to the idea that, okay, I was this voice Crowley says he heard in the corner of the room dictating the Book of the Law. And he even says he saw some shape there, even though he didn't look.
He imagined a shape there, sort of like there. Even though he never looked at it, it impressed upon him a sense of form.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, it speaks really strongly to something going on here. That's again, when you're looking at the way that synchronicities work, it's like, okay, if you try to draw cause and effect to explain things, it's like there would have to be. Everything would have to be connected, and there would have to be some kind of a intelligence that was permeating all those things, and it would kind of drive you crazy trying to think of how you could pull something like that off.
Well, for Crowley, the strongest argument in favor of the sort of magical nature of the book is just how much he disliked it and discounted it and ignored it, and then only after going back to it years later, kind of by accident, discovered the profundity and the power of it. We don't, as readers, have access to that kind of emotional journey that he was on. Mm-hmm. So he tries to harp on it here to explain, it's like no, I wrote it hating it. And one can easily say that they don't believe him, that the emotional evidence is not evidence, because there's no empirical record of it, really, only his claims. And if you're already doubting suspecting that the book might be a forgery, any little story that he might tell around the book, could also be suspect. For me, the way he treats his other forgeries. And then also, one might have been able to predict that, greater technological prowess would lead to more devastating warfare, right? Mm-hmm. But, Crowley was sort of a young man, kind of having the greatest time of his life. And the fact that he would choose this moment to predict 100 years of plus of just devastating calamity, is a bit weird. What I really wanted to point at, though, here is this. He's giving some permission to the psychological model people to have a psychological model, but saying also that they need to have some explanation for how Crowley's subconscious could have been so profound, Mm-hmm. And it basically, if I is not a god and only my subconscious mind, then the profundity of the text makes my subconscious mind, worthy of the title of God.
And even if that, if that was the only discovery to take away from it, the power of the subconscious mind. That's pretty mind-blowing in and of itself.
Yeah, the subconscious mind can, under controlled ceremonial circumstances, be elevated to the position of a deity and do the kind of work that deity is supposed to do, like oh, you know, I'm a prophet channeling legit prophecy, and if that's if I actually am alone and there's no other spirit in here with me, how is that more or less bizarre? Mm-hmm. You know, and so I again, along with my frustration about the rose dictated Liber Al people, that's been married recently in my mind with this idea that Crowley was sitting on the fence between the psychological model and the spirit model. And, you know, sometimes he makes allowances for different people to have different perspectives about things. And you know, is it called hermeneutics? I can't remember. But this idea that different people can speak from different perspectives at different times in their lives. But it seems to me like the whole point of this book is to emphasize the spirit model, the spirit model of magic. So,
yeah, I mean, there is that aspect of it, of course, as well, though, that he does actually allow for other perspectives on the case. And he explores those perspectives, and he tries to take everything into account. He tries to lay bare all the elements that were involved and be as open and honest about it as possible. And this is really important, because some people will just state their pet idea, their pet hypothesis as biblical truth, and just stick by it and fail to be able to accept that they're maybe possibly mistaken, you know?
That's right. I mean, the fact that he's not... he doesn't stop very short of absolutely insisting on his position here.
I did want to point out that this is also this is 1920. That I think there's a couple of other dates that there's been contributions to this particular text, but it's initially dated as 1920, and it's nice to get a context for when he's writing the pieces that he's writing, for just the reason that you're talking about with this reference to hermeneutics and the idea of like somebody being essentially a different person at different stages of their life.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we were talking about when the introduction of the Book of the Law was written, and we didn't know, we should have tried to look it up, and we didn't, because we're trying to deal with what's on the page primarily, rather than doing too much sort of contextual decoration. But yeah, here it's in the footnotes to the text. This is 1920, which means the introduction of the Book of the Law was likely sometime before 1920, because it predicts the forthcoming of this. So he must have been working on both things kind of in tandem and published one before the other. So while this was written in 1920, I suppose we don't know when it was published. But
and I find it interesting because of the fact that, for instance, there was that little portion I was alluding to earlier where he's essentially saying things like, I, the beast whose number is 666, say that this third chapter of the Book of the Law is nothing less than the authentic word of the aeon, the truth about nature at this time and on this planet. I wrote it, hating it and sneering at it, secretly glad that I could use it to revolt against this task most terrible that the gods have thrust remorselessly upon my shoulders, their cross of burning steel that I must carry even to my Calvary, the place of a skull, there to be eased of its weight, only that I be crucified thereon. And he goes through building himself up to be the Jesus of Crowleyanity, essentially. But it's like, it's very in the style of that period.
He's such a good writer. It's just so much fun to read.
It is.
This crazy language, the intensity that he's able to muster in some of these passages is just incredible.
This would have been the Cefalù period. And it would have also been when he was doing a lot of workings involving things that we've alluded to before, which is he was, from his diaries of that period, he was really emphasizing to himself, expanding his ego essentially, because he was exploring that idea of being a god, being a voice for the gods, being this great thing, because he was specifically exploring how Leah Hirsig could be completely stepping on him and crushing him and knocking him down and all this sort of thing. So
I don't know how apocryphal it is, but I think of this as being sort of his tantric period. Really trying to. I mean, it's Leah's going through the mystery of filth. So whether tantra is the right word or not, there's adjacent concepts because they're both trying to sort of overcome their preferences, both moral and physical, and just immerse themselves in the disgusting, the reprehensible, the frightening. There's famously, the nightmare murals at Kefaloon and various other, and the sadomasochism that they were practicing that you allude to. And when what he writes here, but when you quoted that passage that said nothing so bestial that it is not divine, or however he phrases it, that's really the project. That's not the project of Kefaloon, but that's Crowley's project while he's at Kefaloon. And so it's when I say tantric period, I mean like the Agoris who will lay back on corpses and let themselves be fucked by menstruating prostitutes, or get drunk even though their religion forbids imbibing, or hang out in crematoriums and stuff like that and eat out of skulls, not because they're evil, but because they're
because that stuff is abhorrent.
Yeah, but because they're trying to realize the divinity inherent in all things. Malkuth is not just a little ball of shit hanging hanging beneath the tree of life, but that one initiator I spoke with said to me, all things are pure to the pure. And just kind of an offhanded joke, but that's the goal, is to understand, at least in this period, all things are pure to the pure.
Yeah, incidentally, I was at a Tibetan thing years ago, and they passed something around with liquid in it to drink, and years later, somebody else who was at that same thing pointed out to me that was a human skull, and I had no idea. It's like, it doesn't really have the full effect if you don't know beforehand.
Right, you can't. One can't transgress by accident. Well, perhaps they can.
Well, I guess you can.
It doesn't have the same psychological impact.
Yeah, you don't realize it's somebody's property and you happen to trespass. But
a friend of mine was in France, and I think had never been in France. And within sort of 10 minutes of getting in the cab from the airport, saw the kind of French equivalent of the Buddha's three sights, the sick man, the poor man, the dying man. I can't remember all three of them, but one of them was a guy with his pants literally around his ankles, standing on the median and peeing into the street. And then,
you mean that wasn't all three in one?
No, it's enough. And then a few minutes later went and sat down in the grass. And a policeman came over and said, "You can't just sit in the grass, man." It's like, what is France? Like, why is...
I feel like that's like a Ziggy cartoon or something.
Anyway, I suppose one can transgress without knowing it, is the point of that ridiculous story I didn't just tell. Let's finish off this little bit and then get into some of the of the gematria. There's one more section where he enumerates his evidence, gives some thesis. He says the proof of his preternatural nature, meaning Eowaz, is partly external, depending on events and persons without the sphere of its influence, partly internal, depending on the concealment of A, certain truths, some previously known, some not known, but for the most part beyond the scope of my mind at the time of writing. B, of an harmony of letters and numbers, subtle and delicate and exact. And C, of the keys to all life's mysteries, both pertinent to the occult sciences and otherwise, and to all of the locks of thought. Locks of thought? Can you look in your edition, please, at the...
It is locks of thought.
Locks of thought.
Yeah. There's no E at the end of lock. So.
Well, thank goodness. That would be confusing. Now, in the Book of the Law, it's laws of thought. In the Book of the Law, Soldier and the Hunchback, it's laws of thought. But here he says locks of thought.
Well, he is saying the keys, so...
I see.
Pertinent to the context, yeah.
The keys of the locks of... how to unlock thought, yes. So we have enumerated here some of the ways in which, as I said last month, if you had a book which claimed to be of non-human origin, what are some of the ways in which you could evidence that? And here, these things about the author not knowing stuff, things about other readers who receive profound spiritual insight from reading it. And then now, again, we have certain facts, for the most part beyond the scope of my mind at the time of writing, a harmony of certain letters and numbers, subtle, delicate, and exact, so codes and keys in the text itself, and then just how profoundly insightful it is. The keys to all life's mysteries, both pertinent to the occult science and otherwise, and to all the locks of thought. So, and again, C for me is not evidence of its superhuman origin, but sort of, if the book can do what it purports to do, who cares where it came from?
Exactly. And I think that's most to the point. Like, you don't have to be completely buying into one perspective on the matter. If it's useful, success is your proof, as the book itself says.
Are we ready to move on to section 3 here?
Yeah, I'll just before we do, I'll
Sure.
Set it up the way that he does, which is pointing out that the ciphers within the book, many such cases of double entendre, paranomasia.
Thank you for reading that word. I didn't want to read that word.
In one language or another, sometimes two at once. Numerical literal puzzles, and even, on one occasion, an illuminating connection of letters in various lines by a slashing scratch will be found in the Kabbalistic section of the commentary. And he's going to enumerate at least an example for each of these ideas. The three examples are going to be examples of double entendre, paranomasia, and numerical puzzles.
And this is what I was hoping to find when we decided to open this book. And I have here a footnote. Will be found in the Kabbalistic section of the commentary in preparation, and then someone named T.S. appends mostly now lost. So this material is not extant.
I would assume T.S. was TypeScript. Like maybe in the TypeScript for the notes of this, that's where that comes from, unless
perhaps
there was an editor for that version aside from Skinner who actually read the text.
Well, this is just I read both the Skinner and the Hymenaeus Beta, but this is just something I pulled off the internet.
Gotcha.
To mark up.
Interesting, yeah.
Is it?
Yeah, it's interesting.
Which is why I'll sometimes ask you to verify spelling mistakes. Not that either Skinner or Beta would leave in spelling mistakes, but that this stupid scanned version might have them.
Yeah, fair enough. I would like to detail the... okay... I'm sure most people know what double entendre is. It's something with a couple of different layers of meaning to it. Mm-hmm. But the paranomasia is a less frequently used word, which is from the Greek, para being beside, onomasia, meaning naming. So it's like basically, it's like a pun, essentially. It's a play on a word that sounds, you can take it two ways.
So it means double entendre?
Essentially. So we'll have to see how he delineates the difference here.
Well, he says in one language or another. So it may be that
or in multiple.
It may be that a word in English will be a homonym for a word in another
it's a
language.
Sound-alike. That's the key.
And that by reading it, for example, thinking of later he says no and lo sound alike. Lo being the Hebrew word that means not. And so when you see no in a couple of places, it actually means you can imagine not only as being the word no, but also as having the sense of lo, which is
so if you have no K-N-O-W and no N-O.
But then also lo lamad aleph, which would be not N-O-T, so pointing at like the veils of not. So he says he's going to say it's like it like points back at Nuit's technical name.
Ye know not this meaning all.
Yeah.
Not this meaning all. And all seems like al, A-L, and not kind of implies L-A, the opposite.
Yeah, so not is... so not being... L-A being the Hebrew word lo, which...
Mm-hmm. Now he's going to start with this really fascinating situation with his magical child, Frater Akkad, who Charles Stanfield Jones, he was writing to him frequently. Charles, I guess, Akkad, I'll just call him that because everybody, I try to reduce it to one name. That's probably the easiest thing.
Well, that's problematic because we need to know that Parseval is also Akkad.
Welcome to Kabbalah.
And, welcome to the AA. And that Oivvio is also Akkad.
Which is fascinating because that's the initials of his name, which is like Omnia in Unibus, and then Unus in Omnibus. So it's like the reverse of the same kind of thing, which is kind of reflective of that same key that he eventually discovers, the Lo and Al, which is fascinating.
Cool.
Sorry to derail you there.
No, I derailed you. You were saying who Frater Akkad was.
Oh yeah, that's right. Would you fucking calm your tits over there?
It's just trains crashing into other trains all the way down.
Well, we knew it would be force and fire. So, Akkad was basically a member of the AA, and I forget at what point he became a member of the OTO, but he did. And he helped to set up the Agape Lodge that was originally in Vancouver. And eventually that would close and there would be another Agape Lodge opened in California. But at this time, Crowley was in touch with Akkad regularly and was even annotating his diaries up until a certain point. And then at some point, Crowley was on a trip across America and fell in with this woman on a train and had an affair with her, and he saw that as the point, like in hindsight, that the magical child was conceived. Now Akkad was already an adult at this point, but the point being that simultaneous to that period, he was doing sex magic with this woman that he was having an affair with, Hilarion, she took the name as. And at that same time, Akkad was having his crossing of the abyss experience. He was becoming a master of the temple. And Crowley saw this as being an example of how the AA system was showing itself to be extremely effective because he had managed to reach that point in such a short period of time.
I will point out to listeners that we, on purpose, don't do a lot of secondary reading for this. So any minor factual errors in Darren's recounting of that history, we are not responsible for that material coming into our discussion today. However, broad strokes, that's the shape of it. Is this woman Hilarion is the magical mother, and Tomagatherion, the magical father of the birthing of the AA initiate Frater Achad at some point in his development. Mm-hmm. And you think that's I always imagined it was the first time that Achad took his initiation shortly after the sex magic work, but you think it has to do with Achad's crossing of the abyss, his birth as a master of the temple.
It may have been just as a babe of the abyss, which is the stage prior to that, but I just remember that he was undergoing this ceremony, and he sent Crowley message related to just letting him know about what was happening, and Crowley was able to trace it back to he would have sent it at about that time.
So Crowley already knew Achad at the time that he was being born as his magical son.
Yes.
It refers to a stage of his initiation.
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
Yeah, and I think you could probably line up the dates, I would imagine, because Achad's diaries were published in the Equinox 3.1, the Blue Equinox, and in the Master of a Temple. And you could probably line up the dates there with Crowley's recounting of these things and the confessions, I would think.
His probationer diary is there, as well as something from a more advanced stage of the work. There's 2 tracts of diary, but I don't think...
Oh, I don't mean that you would be able to read that particular portion, I suppose, but I just mean that just verifying that stuff would have happened prior to that point in time.
Sure. You know? So here's a brief section from chapter 3 of the Book of the Law. It says, "The fool readeth this book, and he understandeth it not. This has a secret reverse meaning," commentates Crowley. "The fool," open quotes, "Parseval, frater OIVVIO, understandeth it, being Magister Temple of the grade attributed to understanding, not, i.e., to be not." And so Achad, the reason Achad is the fool, or here it says Parseval is the fool, is that Achad means unity, and so the fool is attributed. The fool of the tarot is attributed to the letter Aleph of the Hebrew alphabet, and that's the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, so it has the number 1. So the fool and Achad, unity, number 1, and the tarot card, the fool, they have identity that way.
And the tarot card of the fool is card number 0.
Card number 0.
Hence not.
Very good. But the book itself, Liber Alva Ligus, is Achad's initiated understanding is that that not is somehow a definition of this book, and that doesn't mean that the book doesn't exist, but that it gazes up at the veils of not beyond creation.
Yeah, this is a really fascinating subject, and there's some of this comes up in the Vision of the Voice as well. And I think the Vision of the Voice tends to be overlooked a lot, in my opinion. I think there's a lot of stuff to mine out of that to help, almost as a commentary in and of itself, upon the Book of the Law, or an expansion upon the universe, the Thelemic universe, so to speak. But this idea of not is really key, pun intended, or sorry, paranomasia intended.
And then here, Crowley says that the name Parseval adds to 418. I didn't try to verify that for some reason, but in the Grail legend, Parzival is the son of someone named Kemuret, and apparently Kemuret adds to 666. So this is more evidence that the Tomegatherion 666 is the appropriate magical father of the man Charles Stanfield Jones, whose name Parzival.
Incidentally, I just to catch this Parzival thing, in the story, I just looked up Wikipedia. I want to buy the book, actually, because there's this medieval book, Parzival, which is like a German book, and I think it's based on one of the Knights of King Arthur. But it's this little portion that I did pluck out of it related to this is where his mother's raising him with the intention of avoiding having him getting involved in violence or anything like that, and keeping him safe. But then he ends up catching wind of King Arthur's court, and he wants to go run off and join them, but and he won't take no for an answer. So his mother dresses him up in all kinds of motley colors and makes him look like a complete fool, and sends him off.
So the fool.
Yeah,
Parzival, another reason.
This is where this is also touching on, which is a worthwhile note. But please continue.
And then the magical mother is the Scarlet Woman Hilarion, which Crowley says adds to 1001, which is also important because that'll have an Aleph feeling. If you bold a Hebrew letter, that puts it into the thousands. So 1001 is Aleph Aleph. Incidentally, I could not make Hilarion add to 1001.
I can't help it.
I was mathing it together, and there was no hope.
I think I tried to do this with Parzival as well, and was kind of confused how this was working. But I can't help it. 1001, big Aleph and little Aleph reminds me of the line from the Book of the Law that's sacrifice cattle little and big before a child.
After a child.
Or after a child.
Yeah.
After a child.
And Crowley takes that to mean to be the prediction that what's her name? Not Lola Zaza. The other one. Lilith? Who's the baby who dies?
Oh, he had a few babies that died.
The first one.
I guess wasn't it Lola Zaza?
Was it Lola Zaza?
Maybe it was
Poopy.
Lilith. I have a hard time keeping track of.
Yeah, but Crowley.
I think it was the one with the ridiculous number of names.
Yeah.
I think somebody had made the quip that she had died of over
Paranomasia.
Some clever name that meant too many names. Yeah, she died of overnamedness.
Hypernomia.
Yeah, something like that.
That's so sad. Jesus. But yeah, so Crowley takes the sacrifice cattle, little and big, after a child, but not now, something, and so he takes that to be the prediction that his firstborn daughter is going to die before she reaches her first birthday, and indeed that does happen. So some of, like, as we've already sort of said, some of these numbers are confusing how they come about. But what's important is that there are things about Akkad, being Crowley's magical son, that are predicted in the book. And just saying, "The fool readeth this book and understand it not," is good enough, because we've already proved that the fool is Frater Akkad by the relationship of the Aleph and the tarot card, the Fool. And then what Frater Akkad discovers is that the key to the book is this number 93. I don't think Crowley had known that yet. And that the name of the book is not Liber El, not Liber Lamed, but Liber Al, or El, the name of God. So that's 31. And then the Hebrew word not, Lamed Aleph, Lo, that's the second 31. And then the third 31 the shin and the tav together.
Yeah, that wasn't the recording messing up. That was
It was me trying to do a couple of sibilant consonants without putting a vowel in between.
without making it sound like shit.
Bingo boingo. And this was difficult for me to understand because the letter shin is 300 and the letter tef is 11. So how they add to 31 was a mystery to me. But of course,
teth is 9. You're thinking the tarot card level. Right?
Sorry, the teth is 9. So it was a mystery to me how they added to 31. But as I've slipped, I've put the punchline first. If you just look at the tarot cards, of course, lust is the 11th key of the tarot, and the aeon is the 30th. 20th. The aeon is the 20th. So 11 and 20 are 31. I do not understand where this ST comes from, though. I don't remember it being an important consonant pairing in the Book of the Law. It's the relationship of the beast to the Scarlet Woman or the beast and the Scarlet Woman to the whole universe, the whole aeon that you get by putting those two tarot cards together. That is that talks about the relationship of Crowley to Ra-Hoor-Queet and the coming of the new Thelemic aeon. But do you have any insight? Why ST? Why is this consonant? Is that important consonant cluster in the Book of the Law? ST? I don't recognize it from off the top of my head.
Yeah, it's a difficult one because I feel like when he is going through some of these gematria ideas here, it's almost like he's using shorthand because he's also dealt with them in other places. So that was one of the things I was suggesting as a future subject as well, was to look and specifically gather the places where Crowley talks about the magical word lashtal, which is exactly what we're talking about here. The lo, the LA, followed by st, the shin tav, or properly sigma theta. And he's using a sigma that's not commonly used these days. It's like it looks like a capital C.
Usually sigma looks like a kind of crazy E with a V,
like an indentation. But or as a lowercase letter, it'd be just like an S, but in a slightly strange shape, depending on the position. But when the
two of them embrace, they're supposed to be
the sun and the moon, yeah.
The sun eclipsed by a crescent moon, which can't happen. Or it also looks like a foreshortened phallus.
Yeah, so it's like the male and female conjoined.
If you look at the famous cipher on verse 76 of chapter 2, I guess it is. The last 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 letters, there's a P and then an ST, which is what we're talking about, right? ST, and then OVAL. So it's like Parzival, spelled instead of Parzival, Parzival.
Interesting.
So it's like a Cod's, a sort of a difficult consonant cluster spelling of a Cod's.
It did occur to me as well. There's a place in the 3rd chapter where he, in the commentaries, he's talking about the stele will be 718, and he's trying to figure out how that could work out. And then eventually he figures, okay, stele can enumerate to 718 if you take the S and the T as a double letter.
Oh.
And I think that's probably connected to this. That's probably, that could be specifically where it comes from, but I feel like we have to confer the 2 points.
Also in Thelema there are mysteries of ST gods, like Satan and Set, and there's a whole bunch of sort of like adversary deities that are listed in some places, and the important point is that the Satan, Set. So, these sorts of sharp S's and T's together. So
yeah, and there's a lot of this passage.
Adversarial nature of what's happening with the new aeon against against the old.
Yeah, there's a passage coming up that's very delving into like the idea, the sibilant and the labial and all this sort of thing, the different types of voicings of the letters. And I feel like there was I mean, I could be wrong, I could be mistaken about this, but I feel like there was a particular stage of his life that he was particularly interested in that subject. And
there is work done on this in the modern period, and I forget what it's called. I used to think of it as being onomatopoeia, where, like the word bark sounds like what it describes, but it's not called onomatopoeia, it's called something else. But like, my example was always lunatic. Couldn't possibly mean anything else because the word sounds so crazy. But the way you study this is that you take people who don't speak Japanese and you show them long lists of Japanese words with possible definitions. And often, if you give them two choices, they're able to pick the right meaning because one word sounds bouncier than the other word, just in the way you're forced to pronounce it. And so not every word is like this, which is where Crowley was getting tripped up, because he was trying to find universal meanings for consonant sounds. But there do seem to be meanings for consonant sounds that they invoke a kind of sense that gives you that can give you clues to meanings, and there are types. There's a word for these types of words that's like lunatic, that sort of sound like what they mean. And Crowley's famous example is he thinks the consonant sound M is comforting, like the sound of a mother, like in Hebrew Amma, or in English mom, or in various languages. He always wants to see an M in those words for mom, but then you'll see and I think it's from this period. I think it's from the Kefaloot period. You see him. He talks about, like, sitting on a bus or something and just going and seeing what that F sound makes him feel, and then trying to find other words that feel like that in the languages that he knows, and then noting contrary meanings and saying, like, oh, this screws up my thesis because there's words that start with F that don't make me feel like that. But of course, not every word is in this class of, like onomatopoeia. Not all words sound like the things they describe, but some do, and it does say something about the character of the letter.
Kind of harkens back to the medieval and Renaissance period sort of ontology that tried to find the primal language where the words are somehow intrinsically tied to the things that they are describing.
No, that's a horrible story. That's grotesque. Do you know that? You know this. There's I think it's a Roman emperor, an early one, maybe 300, 400 AD, kidnaps a bunch of children and tries to raise them without human contact, except with each other. And so forcing them to develop a language between themselves in the hopes of getting towards this natural language. And so, people watch the Jungle Book movie and get really into the idea of feral children, but every case of or Tarzan or something like that. But when you actually see histories of feral children, it's always these stories of horrific abuse, and this is the story, the natural language research that's done in the. At least some of these stories are really bad, sad stories. Since we're talking about it, we might as well read it. The import of teeth. All the Hebrew letters have sort of homonyms in the Hebrew language. Like the letter mem sort of sounds like the word mayim, which is the Hebrew word for water, and so mem means water. And the letter Aleph sort of sounds like whatever the Hebrew word for ox is, and it's actually in an older language that I can't remember the name of right now, where these connections exist more materially.
I think it's like Phoenician is probably where it originated from.
But the letter shin sort of has homonymic qualities with the Hebrew word for teeth. So we say that shin means teeth. And so he says, teeth are displayed when our secret self, our subconscious ego, whose magical image is our individuality expressed in mental and bodily form, our holy guardian angel comes forth and declares our true will to our fellows, whether to snarl or to sneer, to smile or to laugh. Teeth serve us to pronounce dental letters, which in their deepest nature express decision, fortitude, endurance, just as gutturals suggest the breath of life itself, free-flowing, and labials the duplex vibrations of action and recantation. Pronounce a t, a d, an ts, or a n, and you will find them all continuously forcible exhalations whose difference is determined solely by the position of the tongue, the teeth being bared as when a wild beast turns to bay.
Yeah, I've heard it put that the teeth are kind of like, the only part of your skeleton you can see, so it's kind of like, a preview.
This might be, the import of your smile is that it might be what you look like when you die.
As far as the proofs go, the one paragraph within this particular chapter, like the proofs that you're talking about, or the quizzing of Rose Kelly, Warda, however you pronounce that Arabic word that she took as a name there. The quizzing of her comes in an earlier chapter in the Equinox of the Gods, and so we're looking at chapter 7, which is... doesn't have that section per se, which does constitute a really interesting way of quizzing the spirits and testing to see, how actually truthful you have things, or how trying to verify the spirits and that there's actually some kind of information that you don't already have that's being attained.
This is one of the things when you're doing like magical evocation work, when you think you're facing a spirit and you're able to have a little bit of a conversation, however that works, whether it's you're asking questions and imagining answers, or whether you're asking questions of a person who's doing some channeling, as in this case, or whether you're doing some sort of scrying work. The idea is that you need to verify that you've actually contacted the entity you intended to contact. And so before you start doing negotiating for whatever it is you want to achieve, you ask it some control questions and see if you can get the correct answers. And so the first thing I always do is use the Thelemic greeting. I just say, do what thou wilt should be the whole of the law, and expect that the spirit will respond in kind. And often they do, but there are times when they don't. And like all this, like whatever spirit you contact, they should know that. So if you don't get the right response, it's evidence that you're dealing with some sort of like static, or like a cacodemon, or something that isn't a refined enough spiritual entity to deserve your attention. In terms of working with it. But there are more detailed questions you can ask about colors and numbers and offices, and names. Naming is a good one because they'll tell you something crazy, and then you have to try to work out how to spell it and make sure the number is appropriate to the sphere that you're dealing with. So I had forgotten that I wanted to talk about this, and I think even if you have it in front of you, even if you could just read through some of those questions that Crowley asks Rose, because it's a template. It's an awesome template for the way in which one should interrogate a spirit to make sure they're dealing with the correct entity. Absolutely.
So, looking at just the list, he's got an enumerated list of 12 points. So, first of all, I asked her to describe his moral qualities, speaking of Rahu or Kuit, who she claimed was trying to come through. I asked her to describe his moral qualities. Her answer was force and fire. And of course, he's not feeding her any information. His whole point here is that she had no background with magic, no background with the way he describes her later on, when he's describing all the details surrounding the circumstance and all the people involved, or who could have been involved in that sort of thing. He's breaking her down as being not like the least likely person, kind of not educated, not interested in magic or mysticism or anything like that. And I mean, when they got together, it was a complete whirlwind thing. So it wasn't like they had spent years together sharing ideas or anything like that. And he wasn't even he was ignoring magic at the time.
I had done a fair amount of path working, which is sort of like, identifying a path on the tree of life and using some mantras or some color cues or something, or some numerical cues, simple things to try to get into it, and then recording whatever images come up. And I had done a fair amount of path working before I really started studying Kabbalistic correspondences and learning what those visions should look like. And I think this is a neat way to organize yourself, because once you're an experienced magician who really has some sense of what the answers to the questions you're asking should be, which you need in order to verify the spirit. Like if you ask it a question about a number and then the number that comes back is meaningless to you, you can't verify that you're speaking to the right entity until later on when you are journaling and you can look the stuff up. But when you're first starting out, doing simple little things like path working and stuff can convince you of the power of scrying work, because then you can go and verify things and realize that the visions you're getting cued off by little colors and stuff are actually quite, you can see whether what you're getting is accurate or not. And so here Crowley is in a sense he's lucky, because like you're saying, Rose is an uninitiated person, and until this exact moment an uninterested person, and all of a sudden she's saying all this stuff which seems quite crazy, telling Crowley that they are waiting for him and stuff like this. She seems to be having some sort of a bizarre psychotic episode, and
he's frankly annoyed by it.
Yeah, but she's insisting that she's got some that she's being spiritually inspired, that she's hearing voices that want his attention. And so when he asks her this list of questions that I'm asking you to read, the fact that she can answer them correctly is really, really weird, and helps to prove to him that there's spirit contact. Now, when if you're doing work either by yourself or with a magical partner who's also an experienced magician, it becomes more difficult, because you know what answers you're supposed to be getting. So the possibility for self-deception is present. And so, you just have to kind of navigate that. In this case, this is a real feat of clairvoyance, if nothing else, for her to be able to guess the right answers. He'll give some statistic, which I have no way of evaluating whether or not he's correct about the statistics, but it's kind of amazing. Anyway,
it does get pretty crazy if this is all how it actually fell out. So number 2, I asked her to describe the conditions caused by him, and she responded that it was a deep blue light. This light is quite unmistakable and unique, but of course her words, though a fair description of it, might equally apply to some other. So he's acknowledging the fact that this is too vague of a point. And it's interesting because later on, at different points when he invokes Aiwas or has similar kinds of interactions himself with Aiwas, he also describes that blue light as well. But like I say, he's not just sort of taking this as anything like a huge hit or anything like that. He's acknowledging that it could be any number of things could apply to this. So the next one is, I asked her to pick out his name from a list of 10 dashed off at haphazard. And so she chose the name Horus, which is the hawk-headed god. Mm-hmm. And he judges that at 1 out of 10, because I guess he had 10 names.
Yeah, sure.
Next up, we have this refers... Oh, I guess he gives all the answers first, and I've been giving the questions first because it's a little without context when you're just reading it out loud. But her answer was recognize his figure when shown. Okay, I guess that's not really an answer. That's just what she did. So she recognizes his figure when shown. This refers to the striking scene in the Bullock Museum, which will be dealt with in detail.
So the idea is that she's now answered all these questions, which we're continuing to try to read here correctly. And the consistent answers to the questions have all pointed at some form of Horus. And then later on, he'll say, "Okay, well, do you think you could recognize the person you're talking to if you saw him?" And she sort of says yes. So they go to the museum, and he says, "Well, somewhere in here, there's going to be an icon of the god Horus." And he sort of chuckles as she walks him past many images of Horus without seeming to notice them, and then settles on the Stele of Revealing, which has a idiosyncratic image of Horus, Heruraha, which is not sort of the standard image, but then also the Stele is numbered 666, which he also takes to be significant. So she, even though she doesn't recognize many images of Horus, the image she settles on is one image of Horus,
and it's not just a image.
It's an image with a significant biblical number that Crowley identifies with.
An image with an exclamation point.
So, so that's another one of the tests he administers to her.
So now she, for number 5, she knew my past relations with the god. This means, I think, that she knew I had taken his place in temple. That is to say, in the Golden Dawn ceremony, there's a position for the god Horus. And that I had never once invoked him. And so, I don't know if this is covered here, but at some point throughout the Equinox of the Gods, he points out that Horus, or Rahu, or Queed, is basically saying that Crowley has neglected him. And this comes from what Crowley takes to be the fact that because of Mathers being overly into the Mars Gebra kind of energy and focused on invoking that, Crowley naturally kind of did the opposite, I guess, and shied away from it and neglected it. So this is kind of the backdrop for that. Then we have, so number 6. She knew his enemy. I asked, who is his enemy? And her reply was, forces of the waters, of the Nile. And he points out that she knew no Egyptology or anything else.
He's a little bit rough on her in this text. So
then they move on to number 7, where she knew his lineal figure and its color. This is one of the things that comes up in the Golden Dawn teachings as well, that each of the Sephiroth is corresponded to a lineal figure and to a color and that sort of thing. And as we've touched on, this is Geburah. So, okay. That seems to be really the nature of the force that's coming through here.
So it would be, because the Sephira are the 10 emanations of God, they're numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Galura would be the 5th Sephiroth, and so his lineal figure would be a shape with 5 sides. And so, 1 is a dot, 2 is a circle, 3 is a triangle, and so she would have been, she would have been shown all these sort of just basic geometric shapes and told to, point at one, and she even guessed that correct, which is kind of nuts.
Yeah, so he lists that as 1 in 12 and 1 in 7 being the chances for the lineal figure, I'm assuming 1 in 12, and then for the color, 1 in 7. And I'm assuming that's probably, at a guess, that would be the planetary colors that he would have been showing her, if it's 1 in 7. And he gives that as an overall chance of 1 in 84. Then for number 8, we have knew his place in the temple, which God knows how she would have, known where in the Golden Dawn temple he would have, Horus would have been placed. And although he gives it as a 1 in 4 chance at the least. So, of course, he must have given her...
Yeah, he would have said, north, south, east, west, and then, or possibly said center, or, however he described it to her. He's not just asking her...
where would she be?
In order to come up with these statistics, he's giving her a multiple choice test, probably in most cases.
Then knew his weapon, and that's from a list of 6, so he's at least explicit with that. And that's 1 in 6 chance for those of you keeping track. And then for number 10. This is going on with this drilling, and this is something Crowley, got shit from spirits later on in his life for, because he just wouldn't let up with the drilling. So, it's like, can we move on to an actual conversation here? No, you gotta continue to prove that this is not bullshit. Number 10, knew his planetary nature from a list of 7 planets, so that's 1 in 7. And that again would be Mars. Then number 11, knew his number from a list of 10 units. So again, Sephirotic, assumedly. So from the Sephiroth. And that's a 1 in 10 chance, of course. Picked him out of A, 5, B, 3 indifferent, i.e. arbitrary symbols. Now that sounds confusing saying that aloud. If you're reading it on the page, it's simple enough, but I don't know how that comes across. But basically, she picked him out of 5 indifferent, that is to say, arbitrary symbols, and then 3 indifferent, that is to say, arbitrary symbols.
So what happens is that Crowley just, for example, might find some stuff lying around the house. A peanut, a house key, a rubber band, a coffee mug,
cigarette.
Lined them all up on the desk. Imagined that one of them had something to do with Horus, and she was able to say, like guess which object he was thinking of. So, whereas the other things are like factual information, I'm saying loosely, but if you're a Golden Dawn practitioner, things that you would know. This is like really just a feat of mentalism that she's able to accomplish.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, that's the list as we have it in that particular position there.
So if you're quizzing a spirit, what are some things that you can apply? You can ask for the spirit's name, the spelling of the spirit's name, which you can reduce to a number to see if it's appropriate to the Sephiroth that you're calling up. You can ask for the spirit's lineal figure. You can ask for the spirit's color. You can ask for its moral qualities. You can ask for, what does he say, the effect of its evocation, which is the sort of the blue light thing.
Yeah,
that
I
he's
guess
talking about.
the what is it? How do you describe it? I asked her to describe the conditions caused by him.
Right, and so there's a lot of options for, Crowley says he would exhaust a spirit by asking too many of these confirmation questions, because as I say, once you get to know what the answers should be, self-deception is really possible. So I guess Crowley dealt with this by just over-interrogating to really make sure, although if you were able to answer all your own questions, I don't know how just asking more questions helps. But these are concise questions with specific answers that you can ask quickly off the hop in any invocatory ritual and get answers to make sure you're dealing with the person you think you're dealing with.
Yeah, and I mean, on that point, asking more and more questions, the places where we specifically seem to have that from Crowley is when he's working with somebody else as a medium. I'm not sure if I can think of a spot where he's talking about doing that just by himself or anything like that, except when he's advising people on their own astral journeys. But when he's like the places where we actually have him doing this, like when he's dealing with Alamantra the wizard or what have you, it's generally what's happening is he's working with a Scarlet Woman, I believe, who's acting as the conduit for this entity. And so that makes it a little easier to work in that way, where it's not just a matter of him already knowing all the answers to the questions that he's asking, but it's somebody else as that medium to test.
Yeah, but again, if you're working with another trained magician, they if they have some of the similar background that you do, as most Thelemites do, they should know a lot of these answers themselves anyway. So
yeah, I mean, he was in his case again. It's like he was working with specifically people that he just met,
right?
It's like who wouldn't have had years of training in this kind of thing or anything like that.
Any interested sexual partner could potentially become a scarlet woman, depending on if they had the right comportment and were willing to jump through some of the hoops, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, there was as a case against those cases to set against that. We have I want to say Elaine Simpson. Is that who he was? Who was also in the Golden Dawn with him, and who he had a liaison with in China after Rose had been sent home. And I think during that liaison, they were invoking. He was excitedly telling her about I was pretty much, and then invoked I was, and there was that blue light that he had spoken about as being part of the conditions surrounding him. But she, in that case, that would have been a case where she would have been well informed about all these things as well. But she was warning him against I was and thinking that it was a demon or something like that. Now, that would be an interesting subject to look at in and of itself. There's a chapter in the Confessions dealing with that, and it'd be fun to dip into that, because that's a really interesting little portion of this adventure.
Now, for the sake of clarity, you were saying that he was looking for verifications to do with the Sephira of Gavura. Now, which spirit is he? Does he think he's interrogating if he's looking for all Gavuric answers? Is it the I was spirit, or is it some form of Horus that he's hoping to verify? What's the number 5?
In this case, he's specifically, because they were talking about Rahu or Kawit being the one with the the spirit coming through. So if I was involved with that, it would have only been as a mediator to it, as he was for the Book of the Law. But that does beg the question. I mean, this is why the blue light, he doesn't really amount to anything. He doesn't really give it too much weight, because it's like it could mean any number of things in this case.
Right.
If it had been red light, then that would have corroborated everything else with the Gaburic kind of energy.
Yeah, but she is able to pick out the colors, so the conditions caused by his evocation are something else.
Yeah.
And okay, so that's interesting. Thank you for going through that with me. So we're coming up on our 2 hours here. We've given some of the ways in which the text can be analyzed by Kabbalistic means. Some of the codes that Crowley himself claims to not have been aware of inserting. We've talked about the prediction of the coming of Frater Achad, the great magical son of Aleister Crowley, and we've talked a little bit in a way that makes me happy about what the reign of the god of war looks like in the 20th century, verifying many of the things that people are most afraid of in Liberal, the problem is he's not arguing, he's telling you. The chapter 7 of this book had, I think, 7 subsections, and we basically addressed 3 of them.
We did anticipate a few of them, but some of them are kind of nuts and boltsy as well, so it's not really that,
But I wonder, we don't have to finish everything we start.
It's true.
It's okay. Anything you want to say by way of closing after we've been through this material?
Yeah, does this seem like we've got verified proof of discarnate intelligence? How do we feel about that?
I don't think it's unique proof. I think the story of how the Enochian tablets are received is very, very weird. But I suppose at the time that this is written, there wasn't so much introductory material on Enochian magic as there is now, and that story hadn't been summarized by, every scam artist trying to make a buck for since the 1970s or whenever. So if you go with Crowley on this journey and start to look at some of these details, do they become spooky? I don't know if it ever becomes particularly spooky to me, but maybe that's because I'm a Thelemite who just believes in the story of the reception. And it never says, the First World War will break out in 1914. Yeah. It just says danger, I am the god of war and vengeance, and I shall deal hardly with them, So things like get the stele of revealing itself and lock it behind glass, and, it will be as a proof. Crowley fails to do this. He never does that. He never buys, borrows, or steals the stele of revealing from the museum in Cairo. And you can look at all the wars and stuff in the Middle East of being evidence that it would have been nice to get it out of there before the Arab Spring, perhaps, but it remains. It hasn't been, it's not that all these, it's not that the museum has been burnt to the ground and the artifact lost. So,
speaking of burnt to the ground, though, your house,
yeah,
that's a fun one. That was an interesting prediction when that came true. Essentially, at least the first part of it.
Yeah, that's a bit weird because you're supposed to get the stele of revealing itself and put it in the house, and then it will be, it will last forever, and then even if it's burned with fire, it will be. Anyway, it's sort of like with the house. It's sort of like we would have lost the stele if it had been in the house.
So what I'm referring to is, but your holy place shall be untouched throughout the centuries. Though with fire and sword it be burnt down and shattered, yet an invisible house there standeth and shall stand until the fall of the great equinox.
Yeah.
And so a few years ago, Boleskine House, which Crowley took as being that house, was burnt down. And has since been getting rebuilt.
This is because it will standeth there forever, and even if it's burnt down, a spiritual house will remain. If it had never been burnt down, that would have fulfilled the prophecy, and it has been burnt down, so that's taken as a fulfillment of the prophecy. But like I said, I kind of think what's important about the Book of the Law is the way it spiritualizes, or is the way it inspires Crowley to create a system of magic that spiritualizes Nietzsche's teachings in a way that allows them to be applied, so that we can now make practical steps to move into the new aeon using our magic and meditation work without trying to destroy ourselves in the way Buddhist monks, Christian monks, various yogic practitioners do. We have an approach devoted to what Yogananda called self-realization, And I think that's really, and not just self-realization the way Yogananda meant it, where like I realize that I am God, but that I have a purity doctrine that allows me to fully integrate all aspects of my being, rather than thinking some things are pure and some things are
rather
impure.
than thinking of Malkuth as the dingleberry.
Jesus Christ. So am I impressed by this stuff? I don't know, maybe not really, but I'm impressed by what the text itself inspires me and other people to do, and especially by what it inspired Crowley to build when he built Thelema. And I mean, to me, the most convincing thing, as I keep saying, is just this idea that like I've done forgeries. This is not how I do forgeries. I believe in the reception. I believe in the reception, but I believe in the reception kind of as a historian, because we have no evidence to disprove anything Crowley said about it.
Well, again, success is your proof, right?
If you just read the texts that tell the story of the reception, and it is so unlike anything else Crowley ever wrote, that I believe it happened sort of the way he said it did, because if it didn't, he would have made it look like something else.
Well, the reason for kind of believing in something, or for taking something up in that sense, is essentially you could say that it's giving you some kind of courage and some kind of usefulness and some kind of meaning. And there's that passage in the first portion of this chapter, which was genius goes with courage, and the sense of shame and guilt with defeatism. So the nihilistic kind of defeatism is the thing that Nietzsche was warning against. And this is kind of giving us, the Book of the Law gives us something in response to that.
Wow. Thanks very much, Darren. This was great.
Thank you.
Love is the law, love under will.
Love is the law, love under will. Thank you for joining us. Look for Toronto Thelema on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. Watch for events in the city. And join us again in the darkly splendid abodes. This book was inserted into the appendices for Book 4. The set of books that are Book 4, Volume 1, Yoga, and then Book 4, Volume 2, Magick.
Then Volume 3 is Magick in Theory and Practice, and this is Part 4.
Yeah, so it's not an appendix at all.
No.
Today we're looking at the Equinox of the Gods, which is not an appendix, but an actual book from it's the fourth book of the book called Book 4.
Do you want to start again? We can roll through this if you like.
Yeah. I might just have to go with it anyway, unless, of course, this would just make people hit that old skip button.
We're not coming off as particularly authoritative.
Whoops.